What's going on, IVE Warriors? Today we're going to talk about something interesting. 5 things researchers learned about intermittent fasting in 2021. Why are we talking about this? Because it's important. Science is an ever-evolving, ever-changing element in our lives. And if we don't consistently look at the current body of work, it just can't be one study here, one study there. We have to look at the consistent body of work so that we can get a better depiction of whatever diet or regimen that we choose to utilize for our weight loss and health. So without any further ado, let's talk about those 5 things that researchers learned about intermittent fasting in 2021. Okay, we're gonna jump straight into it right away. Number 1 is that the circadian rhythm attached to your intermittent fasting schedule, essentially time-restricted feeding, which focuses on eating earlier rather than later, has shown more and more prominent over the past year, and it's shown that there is a viable strategy there where you're eating in line with how your metabolism is working throughout the day. Sometimes earlier you have a more faster metabolism and your metabolism tends to slow down with your own circadian rhythm, with the circadian clock. And when you connect your eating windows and fasting windows within that flow, almost like you're connecting it like a Lego or a puzzle piece within your circadian rhythm, the results have been very positive. Many of the early time-restricted feeding studies from 2021 have shown a positive effect for the participants who were doing fasting versus the control where they were not doing intermittent fasting. And even studies in 2021 looking at intermittent fasting and early time-restricted feeding, where you do your fasting window earlier and eat later versus doing your fasting window later while eating earlier. And the studies are consistently showing that earlier eating is showing itself to be much better, not just for weight loss specifically, but also for things like appetite suppression, hormonal health like leptin increase, where your body is aware when you feel full, and even things like ghrelin decrease, where your body does not constantly feel hunger or a desire to want to eat. Now, of course, take everything with a grain of salt because it's still studies and there are still non-responsive group. You got to do what works for you. You can try this if you want, but if you're doing something that works for you, the lifestyle change is the most important. So I don't want to say this and make you think, well, I've been doing so well with eating later rather than earlier. Do I have to switch now? Absolutely not. If you're doing well and you can flow with that and you have a good lifestyle change that you know that you're set, you can actually just keep doing this. That is much better than just trying to get the small differences that you would get from eating earlier rather than eating later. Now let's go ahead and move on to number 2. Short-term studies data has made it abundantly clear that intermittent fasting is a viable tool to use for weight loss and even health. Things like looking at blood metabolites, where there are different metabolic benefits that come directly from intermittent fasting, and the weight loss as well as health markers. Because one thing that was always a thing that was lingering with intermittent fasting is that people stigmatize that word simply because of the word fasting. It's almost like you're starving yourself, when in reality, you're just doing a short-term fast. You're not eating for 16 hours, and that is essentially like doing a low-calorie diet in terms of keeping your body from a consistent energy source like food. So the studies are continuing to show that this is a viable tool for fitness. This is something that you can use to actually help you reach your fitness goals. And unlike what they thought in the past back in 2001, when studies were really starting to ramp up on intermittent fasting, researchers were basically on the fence and they didn't know for sure if they could kind of recommend intermittent fasting. But after all of the studies, plus 2021 reaffirming that it is a viable tool, it seems that now researchers and scientists are deciding that, yeah, intermittent fasting is a viable tool that you can use just like simply doing caloric restriction. You can do intermittent fasting with caloric restriction, or intermittent fasting ad libitum, which means you can eat how you want, but because of the way intermittent fasting is structured, it can help you actually create a caloric deficit regardless of the fact that you're paying attention to it or not. So in terms of a fitness tool, 2021 has shown researchers that intermittent fasting is definitely one of them. And number 3 is kind of like number 2, but number 2 is basically saying that this is a good fitness tool. Number 3 tackles the health part of it. The safety of the short-term data that we have with intermittent fasting has essentially been reinforced, where researchers confidently recommend it. No longer are they worried about the safety of intermittent fasting. Just keep in mind, however, everything is on a person-by-person basis. You may not react to something as good as someone else. Caloric restriction could be very bad for someone else, but not for you. Every single thing that would require you to lose weight or create an intervention for you to hit your fitness goals, there might be something that I can do that you can't do. And there's always non-responder groups in the study. And just so that you know what that means, if 80% of people show that this is a positive thing, there's still 20% that showed that it wasn't. And that means that the majority of the population, if it's scientifically devised, that sample size could represent the population to a certain degree. So the majority of the population may benefit, but there are still probably 20% of the population that may not benefit from doing this thing, or may not physically or metabolically sit well with them. Same thing with everything else, a specific diet, just reducing your calories, increasing your calories, you name it. Any type of diet switch can be good or bad. You have to try it for yourself, but the studies give us a better indication for what the likelihood is. And it's showing that short-term intermittent fasting is as safe as any of the other diets that you choose. Another thing that we learned in 2021 is that it is not optimal for building muscle. This was always on the fence. There were things that were obvious, like the of, well, it's not part of the protein synthesis kind of equation, or it doesn't hit the optimal level of protein synthesis, as protein synthesis requires an elevated caloric intake to be at a net positive energy balance, where you're gaining weight from your calories. That's one layer to protein synthesis. The high intake of protein itself, it's another layer of protein synthesis. And doing resistance training, building muscle through physical activity, that's part of the protein synthesis. That's part of this protein synthesis umbrella to get you into a heightened state of anabolism. But also, meal frequency was one of them. But intermittent fasting could tackle all of the others except for meal frequency. And things are happening slightly different hormonally when you do intermittent fasting. So it was still up in the air. We did not know if it was a viable option for those who did resistance training. Many studies in the past, like in 2016, shown that there were people that were able to build muscle optimally with intermittent fasting. But with more studies put together, more meta-analysis, it is clearly being shown that it's more than likely not the optimal way to go when it comes to building muscle. You probably want to go ahead and provide meal frequency, higher meal frequency, which means eating more meals throughout the day to add to that protein synthesis. Now, it doesn't mean that the average Joe cannot build muscle. This just means that to be as optimal as possible, intermittent fasting would probably not put you there. And this is usually for people who are really heavy in building muscle, who are focusing on that, and they're trying to get to the next level and to the next level, and they're finding plateaus and things like that in terms of hypertrophy over long stretches of time, and they need to do something that's more optimal. If you chose intermittent fasting in those moments, you're probably not going to be doing the most optimal thing for building muscle. And building muscle is super important because lean mass and lean tissue is the primary driver for your metabolic rate. And we need to ensure that we are retaining muscle, bare minimum, and trying to build muscle. So at least if we're not building, we're trying to retain. When it comes to muscle building, intermittent fasting has not been shown to be the most optimal to choose. And finally, intermittent fasting has had a plethora of short-term study data. And by short-term, I mean there's been studies looking at 3 months or studies looking at 6 months. But in terms of long-term studies, they are very few and far between. They haven't done many of those, but they've done a few in 2021. And it has shown that intermittent fasting is still showing itself to be a viable lifestyle option for you to use for your health and fitness goals. Just keep in mind, there are very few of them still. So you always should measure what's going on with yourself when doing something like intermittent fasting. That's something that you should focus on to ensure that it is working specifically for you. Even regardless if the studies is just a guide to know what's a higher probability of something happening for you or not happening for you. But still, you should always be testing things for yourself to ensure that it works for you. But with the small amount of long-term studies that we've had, for example, although not perfect, looking into religious fasting and looking at religions that do it consistently on a weekly basis, not just on specific time frames, and looking at the years of them doing that and the reciprocating effects and the reciprocating metabolic health effects and weight loss that is attached to that, as well as creating certain data that is looking at longer than 6 months with intermittent fasting and seeing the results of that as well. And that's promising, but still we need more data. What we've learned is that with the small amount of information, it is looking like it is promising going into that direction where you could just do this as a lifestyle, where the science and the data is moving in that direction, is trending in that direction, where intermittent fasting can be not just a short-term tool, but also a long-term tool and a lifestyle change as well. Hopefully this video was helpful. Patreons, of course, will be pinned in the comment section below, and I'll see you in the next one. Peace.